At the reunion, my aunt mocked me as a college failure. Hours later, my sister's fiancé Googled my name, his face went pale, forks froze midair, and suddenly everyone knew who they'd ridiculed. You ever feel like your own family has already written your life story for you, and you're just stuck playing the villain? For years, every single gathering was a fresh wound, a harsh reminder of everything they thought I wasn't. But what if, one day, the script flipped so hard that they were forced to watch their own carefully constructed narrative crumble, not because of anything I said, but because the rest of the world saw something completely different? My name's Callum. I'm 29, and for most of my life, I was the family joke. Not the funny kind, you know? The kind where people laugh to make sure you know exactly where you stand. Our family had this invisible seating chart. My sister Nora, bright, successful, always at the center. My brother Ethan, orbiting my dad's approval like a satellite, never daring to stray. My mom, perpetually arranging napkins into swans, pretending ignorance was kindness. And then there was Aunt Lorraine, armed with gossip and a glass of sweet tea that was never just tea. Me? I was usually somewhere near the folding chairs, useful only if the printer jammed or someone needed the Wi-Fi password. Getting a text about a reunion never felt like an invitation. It was a summons. A command to show up and prove I belonged in a room that still saw me as the one who didn't finish. If you ask them, my reputation started sophomore year of college. I withdrew 2 weeks after midterms, and they'll tell you I gave up, I ran off, I made a mess. That version was easy for them to fit into the story they already believed. The truth was far less dramatic and a whole lot lonelier. My financial aid package had changed. A paperwork hiccup, they said, that would likely be resolved next semester. But the math didn't lie. The money was gone, and the bills were immediate. Rent didn't negotiate, and my part-time campus cafe job couldn't cover a black hole. I walked home with that withdrawal form in my pocket, telling myself it was just one semester off. That's not how my family remembers it. He quit college to chase some scheme, Aunt Lorraine still likes to say. Our stories split right there and never found their way back. After I left school, I worked 2 jobs, then 3. I learned to repair phones at a strip mall kiosk under humming fluorescent lights that made your skin look gray. I drove a battered sedan at night, the back seat smelling of old fries and spilled soda. I slept 5 hours on good days and dreamed in numbers. Rent due on the 1st, loan interest on the 15th, a paycheck hitting at 12:03 a.m. if payroll was feeling generous. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I was just on the off-ramp, a little lost, but I'd find the main lane again. What I didn't say out loud was this: sometimes I actually liked the work. There was a pattern to making broken things whole. A cracked screen becoming a glass pane again. A dead battery waking up at 87%. Hunched over a tiny board with tweezers and solder, I could concentrate in a way that made the rest of the world dim. It felt like solving a puzzle everyone else had decided wasn't worth their time. The first time I told my dad I could fix his phone instead of him buying a new one, he just frowned at the kitchen table. "You're not a technician, Callum," he said. "You're a kid who never finished what he started." He didn't mean it cruelly. In our house, statements like that were just neutral facts. Mom slipped a casserole into the oven. "Bright as ever," she murmured. "Well, maybe a professional should take a look, sweetie. We wouldn't want to make it worse." That's how love sounded there, like careful steering away from the thing you were trying to say. By dessert, Aunt Lorraine was already texting herself reminders to share the update with cousins. "He's doing phone screens now." Poor thing. I watched the family group chat light up with sympathetic thumbs and shock faces, then flipped my phone face down. You learn to set your own notifications, what you'll let in, what you'll ignore. They say your 20s are for experimenting. Mine were for shutting doors softly and walking away. I stopped bringing girlfriends to holidays. I stopped applying for jobs that required a degree because I could already hear my father's sigh in the margins of every application. Instead, I got good. Quietly good at a narrow thing almost nobody else cared about. I learned board-level repairs. I learned data recovery. I learned that small businesses bled cash when their point-of-sale machines died on a Saturday. I learned that if you could show up on time, return devices when you promised, and speak to people without making them feel stupid, you could negotiate your own price. Word of mouth did what family never tried to do. There's a kind of humility that grows in the cracks where approval should have been. I cultivated it without even knowing. I rented a workbench in the back of a computer shop owned by a retired teacher who thought the world of me because, unlike my family, he liked the version of me who existed in plain sight. On paper, I was still the kid who left school. On invoices, I was the guy who saved his school's attendance records and kept a bakery open after a lightning strike. Those felt like two different people until slowly, they became the same one. When Nora got engaged last winter, the family group chat turned into a fireworks show. Everyone had opinions about venues, color palettes, photographers. Dad promised to cover the bar. Mom started a Pinterest board. Ethan offered to take care of the playlist like he was volunteering for war. I typed congratulations and sent a gift I could afford, a private session with a chef I'd done some recovery work for, who owed me a favor and genuinely liked Nora. She was the only one who sometimes texted me on random Tuesdays to ask how my week was going. The only person who occasionally said, "You know, Callum, you're really good at what you do." That meant something, even if I never said so. It was Nora who called the morning of the reunion. "You're coming, right? Please say yes." It wasn't actually about the reunion. It was about the wedding. She wanted the whole family on neutral ground before we all collided in tuxedos and seating charts. It would mean a lot, she added. She has my mother's voice, but not the habit of arranging the truth so it looks nicer. I hesitated. Then I pictured her fiancé, Mark, who I'd met twice. A tall, polite civil engineer with steady eyes who listened more than he spoke. He asked questions the way people ask if they can pet your dog, aware of boundaries, respectful, interested if invited. I got the sense he hadn't been to many Hayes reunions. I said yes. The reunion was at my Aunt Lorraine's house. It looks like a magazine layout, the kind that insists every surface should have a bowl on it. The front lawn didn't have a single rebellious blade of grass. The kitchen was already hot from the oven and the gossip. I parked down the street and sat in my car for 1 minute longer than necessary. It's the ritual you do before a place that has decided who you are. I took a breath, then another. The rearview mirror showed a face I sometimes didn't recognize. A little older jaw. A shade tighter. Then I got out and walked toward the noise. Lorraine met me at the door, because, of course, she did. "Don't expect any respect here. You're still the failure who never finished college," she said, smiling the way people smile when they think honesty equals virtue. Her perfume drifted out first, then her bracelet clinked as she stepped aside, a tiny bell to summon the room's attention. Behind her, I could see heads tilt. Cousins noted my shoes. An uncle raised his brows as if checking whether I'd dressed up enough to fail in. My mother looked away as if someone had called her from a different room. My father, who always stands with one hand in his pocket and one on a drink, did both, a trick I still don't understand. "Happy reunion to you, too," I said lightly. If there is a uniform for surviving family gatherings, mine is the easy tone, the shrug that says, "None of this lands." I stepped inside, kissed my mother's cheek, shook my father's hand. He squeezed too long, which is his way of saying behave. Ethan clapped my shoulder like I was a coworker he decided to tolerate and leaned in. "Just don't embarrass us tonight, okay?" He said it quietly for my benefit, as though he was doing me a favor by keeping the insult personal. "Wouldn't dream of it," I replied, and he laughed like we were sharing a joke. Maybe we were. I wasn't sure which of us was meant to be the punchline. The first hour was a choreography of small talk and thinly veiled comparisons. Lorraine pressed a lemonade into my hand and announced loudly, "Non-alcoholic for Callum," as if I had ever had a public incident to justify that choice. A cousin my age asked if I'd found anything stable yet, with a sympathy tilt to her head, like she was talking to someone who had recently lost a pet. My uncle asked if I still tinkered with gadgets. And before I could answer, my father chuckled and said, "He keeps busy." The words hung under the ceiling fan like a fruit that never ripens. I nodded and changed the subject to sports I didn't follow because that made everyone more comfortable. Nora found me by the deviled eggs, pressed a quick hug into my side, and whispered, "I'm sorry." In that way siblings do when they're apologizing for something much bigger than a moment. Her fiancé, Mark, hovered nearby, doing that calm, attentive thing of his, asking her mother about flower arrangements, helping move a cooler without being asked. He saw me and brightened. "Hey, Callum," he said, putting out a hand. A normal handshake. A human handshake. Not a measuring contest. "Glad you could make it." He meant it, which was rare currency in that room. I stayed close to the edges. Old habits. It's easier to exit from there if you need to. And you can see incoming weather. The kitchen island became the center of gravity. Cold salads, a honey-baked ham, a plate of crackers arranged like dominoes. Someone had put a framed photo of my grandparents on the counter, and their faces looked fresher than anyone in the room. They'd had these reunions too, I realized. Different menu, same theater. At some point, conversations braided into bigger ones. Someone retold the story of how Nora landed her new job, the details inflated just enough to make my mother's eyes shine. Ethan announced he was maybe moving up at his firm and let the maybe dangle like bait. There was a toast to Nora and Mark's upcoming wedding, which became a second toast when Lorraine realized the first hadn't included a pointed message about families sticking together no matter what. I lifted my glass with everyone else and swallowed lemonade that had gone warm in my hand. Then came the tiny shift, the one that always starts the avalanche. Lorraine's neighbor stepped in with a casserole, and because I was nearest the door, I took it. "Careful," she said, surprised. "Wow, strong. What do you do, young man?" It was innocent. She didn't know the language we speak in that house. The script that says you may ask Nora about her team and Ethan about his clients, but you ask me only about the weather. "I repair and recover data," I said, before I could package it into something smaller. "I run a small operation." I cut off the extra words, the ones that would have sounded like bragging or defense, and set the casserole down. Lorraine's ear twitched. My father's gaze slid over without turning his head. You could feel the temperature change by a degree. "Recover data?" Mark asked, curious. "Like for phones or companies?" His tone didn't have skepticism in it. It had interest, which is a difference my family taught me to register like a weather warning. I nodded. "Both," I said. "Mostly small businesses, schools, medical practices." I was preparing to divert, to ask him about a bridge he was working on or a road project that had surprised him, when Aunt Lorraine's voice, bright as a chandelier, cut through. "He's being modest," she sang. And for a moment, my heart weirdly lifted, because Lorraine never called me modest. Then she added, "He's very good at tinkering. We keep him around because he can fix the toaster." Laughter. Not cruel, exactly. Just easy, and at my expense. The neighbor smiled politely, unsure. My mother shifted a napkin. My father sipped his drink. "I have learned there are options in a moment like that. You can correct the record. It will be taken as aggression. You can joke back. It will be filed under defensive and repeated later as proof that you cannot take a joke. You can leave. That becomes a story someone else gets to tell. Or you can do what I did, which is smile with your eyes and not your teeth, and let it pass through you like weather." "The toaster never thanks me," I said lightly. "I'm still waiting on a card." It got a ripple. The neighbor laughed. The moment slid by, but a note had been struck, and the song had started. Dinner found me next to Mark at the long table, while Nora ran point on courses and conversation. Lorraine had placed me there, I could tell, by the place cards, between Mark and a cousin who collects other people's business like charms on a bracelet. Across from me, my father held court with Ethan, performing competence by talking about things he didn't build. Mark leaned in quietly. "Can I ask you more about your work?" he said, his voice low enough that it didn't carry. I nodded. He asked good questions. Not the kind that look for weak spots, but the kind that cost time and attention. I gave careful answers. He was about to ask another when Nora's maid of honor, one of those people who is always popping over, dropped into the empty chair on Mark's other side. "So, what do you do?" she asked me, not unkindly, just loudly, because that's her volume, and because she had no idea that the table had rules around us. Forks paused. Heads turned on instinct. There it was again, the start of weather. I felt my aunt's ears perk from 3 seats away. I heard Ethan's breath hitch, because he loved these moments, little stages where I was supposed to trip. My father's eyes went soft, in that way he did when he braced for what he considered my overcomplication of simple questions. Mom smiled tightly and pressed her palm flat on the tablecloth, like she could smooth the room. "I repair and recover data," I said again gently. "I run a small shop, plus some consulting." The maid of honor blinked. "Consulting for who?" And before I could flatten the truth into something that fit the timeline everyone had written for me, Mark, noticing the puzzle in my answer and the heat of the room, did what engineers do. He reached for his phone to find a reference point. "What's your business called?" he asked, casual, curious, simply trying to complete a picture. I told him the name. He typed it into the search bar. The screen lit his face. The table noise thinned into a clear, high silence, the kind that comes right before a glass tips or the power goes out. And while he waited for the results to load, I watched something move across his expression. A small shift of recognition, then focus, then something sharper I couldn't name yet. He looked from the phone up to me, as if to confirm that we were talking about the same person. Across the table, I could feel my aunt leaning, my brother smirking, my father's hand tightening around his fork. Mark's thumb hovered 1 inch above a link I knew too well. But before he could tap it, Lorraine's voice cut in like a knife. "Careful what you look up, Mark," she trilled, lifting her glass. You might get bored scrolling through stories of broken microwaves and secondhand laptops. A ripple of laughter followed, cousins snickering like kids at the back of a classroom. Ethan leaned in across the table with a smirk that said he couldn't wait to watch me squirm. Yeah, let's not embarrass him, he added. We all know Callum's career path is kind of a family mystery. Mom pretended to fuss with the salt shaker, her silence a signal that she wouldn't step in. Dad tapped his fork against his plate, the metallic click carrying more weight than words. It was his way of saying, asterisk, don't escalate. Don't make a scene, asterisk, I felt my face heat, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep my expression neutral. Years of practice had taught me the art of stillness, how to take the barbs without giving them the satisfaction of watching you bleed. Meanwhile, Nora's eyes flicked between me and Mark, silently pleading for calm. She knew what was coming. Every reunion had its script, and I was always cast as the character who never measured up. Lorraine leaned forward, lowering her voice just enough to make the words sharper. It's sweet, really. Everyone needs a hobby. Keeps him out of trouble. Across the table, one cousin muttered something about me still living paycheck to paycheck, loud enough for others to hear. Forks clinked, heads shook, and the air thickened with that familiar mix of pity and amusement. I wanted to vanish, but part of me, quiet, stubborn, also wanted to hold my ground. I looked at Mark, who still had his phone in hand, the screen glowing faintly. His brows were furrowed now, but not in mockery. He looked curious, maybe even unsettled. So, he said carefully, you handle data recovery? He emphasized the last two words, like he was trying to drag the conversation back to neutral ground. Lorraine rolled her eyes and raised her voice again. Mark, darling, don't encourage him. He'll start talking in acronyms and wires, and we'll all die of boredom before dessert. The table chuckled. My father finally spoke, his voice low but firm. Let's not get carried away. On the surface, it was a call for peace, but I knew the subtext. Asterisk Callum, swallow it down. Don't push back. Don't ruin the evening. Asterisk, my chest tightened as I stared at my plate. For years, I'd done just that. Kept quiet. Let them shape my narrative into something pathetic and unfinished. Tonight, though, something felt different. Maybe it was Nora's pleading glance, or Mark's steady gaze, or the simple fact that I was tired. Tired of being reduced to a caricature every time I walked through this door. But still, I stayed silent for now. That silence gave them permission to keep going. Ethan leaned back in his chair, grinning. You know what's funny? He said, his voice rising. Every time I go out, someone asks if I'm related to Callum. I never know what to say. I mean, what would you tell people if your brother was fixing coffee machines for a living? The cousins roared. Lorraine covered her mouth like she'd just heard the most scandalous secret. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. Dad sipped his drink without looking at me. The laughter echoed around the table, and I could feel myself shrinking into the same corner I'd occupied for years. But then I caught Mark glancing at his phone again, his thumb tapping, his jaw tightening ever so slightly as he read. His expression shifted from curiosity to something colder, sharper. He looked at me, then at the rest of the table, and I realized he had found what they were all too blind or too unwilling to see. And that's where the tension began to thrum louder than their laughter. The laughter hadn't even died down when Ethan decided to twist the knife. He leaned back, the smugness practically dripping from his grin. Actually, he said, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear, you know what's really crazy? Last year, Dad almost had to cover one of Callum's bills because he was short on rent. Isn't that right? He looked at me with mock innocence, as if daring me to deny it. The room went quiet in that way it always does before a storm. Forks frozen halfway to mouths, eyes darting between me and my father. I clenched my jaw because I knew exactly what he was referring to. Months ago, before one of my biggest contracts had come through, I'd asked Dad, not for money, but for a short-term loan I intended to pay back in full. He'd refused, and that was the end of it. Or so I thought. I'd kept that conversation private, humiliating as it already was. But now Ethan had dragged it out into the open, twisting the truth into something poisonous. Don't look so surprised, Ethan chuckled, glancing at my cousins. Some people just never figure it out. You can't rely on dreams to pay the bills. My face burned, and for a split second, I thought I might actually stand up and leave. But then, Dad cleared his throat, his voice calm, but edged with disappointment. It's true, he said flatly. Callum came to me when he was in trouble. I told him he needed to stand on his own 2 feet. We don't reward failure in this family. Failure. The word landed like a brick in my chest. And the worst part? He didn't even sound angry. Just resigned, like it was an immutable fact of my existence. Mom tried to jump in with a nervous laugh, saying, well, it all worked out, didn't it? But the damage was already done. My cousins were whispering. Lorraine wore a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Nora's eyes widened, flashing between me and Dad, and Mark froze mid-bite, his phone still lit up beside his plate. I stared at my father, the betrayal heavier than anything Ethan could have thrown at me. He hadn't needed to confirm it. He could have brushed it off, defended me, or simply said nothing. But instead, he chose to humiliate me in front of everyone, using my lowest moment as proof that I was exactly who they believed me to be. Stand on my own 2 feet, I repeated softly, my voice steady but low. My father didn't meet my eyes. He just reached for his glass again, as if the matter was settled. That was the turning point. Something inside me shifted like a door slamming shut. For years, I tolerated the snide remarks, the digs, the sideways glances. But hearing my father, my own father, label me as a failure, not in private, but as a public declaration to everyone at the table, was the moment I realized the gulf between us wasn't just wide, it was permanent. And just as that thought settled in my chest, Mark finally tapped the link on his phone. His eyes widened as the page loaded, and I watched his face drain of color. Whatever he had just seen, it wasn't the story Lorraine and Ethan had been peddling. He looked at me like he was seeing someone completely different. And the silence that followed was heavier than the betrayal itself. That was when I knew everything at this table was about to change. The betrayal clung to me like smoke. I could still hear my father's words echoing in my skull. We don't reward failure in this family, as if he'd been waiting years for the perfect stage to say them. I sat frozen at the table, unable to force another bite of food past the knot in my throat. Everyone else went back to their plates, though the air was charged, awkward, humming with the aftershocks of what had just been said. I wasn't even Callum, the relative anymore. I was Callum, the cautionary tale, the example they'd pass down to their kids about what not to become. I excused myself quietly, slipping out onto the back porch with my glass of lemonade still in hand. The air was cool, a relief against my burning face, but it didn't soothe the heaviness in my chest. I leaned against the railing, listening to the muffled laughter inside. It was surreal how quickly they could move on after cutting me open. To them, this was routine. I was the family's designated failure. And tonight, they just added another story to the growing pile. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A friend had sent me a text asking if I wanted to grab a late drink. Nothing urgent. I stared at it for a long time, realizing that outside this house, I wasn't treated like a punchline. Outside, I was simply Callum, the guy who solved problems, kept his word, showed up when it mattered. Inside, I was nothing but the space they needed to fill with their disappointment. And for the first time, the thought hit me hard, maybe I didn't have to keep showing up at all. Still, leaving right then felt impossible. Nora had begged me to come, and Mark's confused expression lingered in my mind. He'd seen something on that screen, and I wasn't sure if he understood what it meant yet. If I left now, the narrative would belong to them. They'd say, see, he can't even handle dinner without storming out. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. So I stayed, even as I sank lower inside myself. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted. Ethan was bragging about a promotion he might get, and Lorraine was busy recounting a story about one of her neighbors. I slipped back into my seat like a ghost, invisible, irrelevant. Nobody asked where I'd gone. Nobody looked my way. Even my mother's eyes skimmed past me, too afraid to linger. That's when the loneliness hit me harder than the humiliation. I realized I wasn't just sitting at a table full of relatives. I was sitting at a table full of strangers who had long ago decided I didn't belong. I was blood without bond, family by name, not by heart. And in that moment, I started to imagine a life without them. A life where their voices didn't echo in my head every time I tried to take pride in something. I kept my face calm, my movements steady, but inside, gears were beginning to turn. If this was how they truly saw me, then fine. I could live with their silence, their mockery, their willful ignorance. But one day they would see, not through my words, not through arguments, but through something undeniable, something that didn't need defending. For the rest of dinner, I barely spoke. I let them laugh, let them boast, let them pile another story onto the tower of failures they thought defined me. I let myself sink to rock bottom because there was a strange clarity down there, an understanding that you could either stay buried or start building something from the ground up. And as I sat there in that silence, with the weight of my father's betrayal still pressing against my chest, I made a quiet decision. If they wanted me to play the failure, I'd let them, because the day would come when the truth would crash through their carefully constructed narrative. And when it did, it would be louder than all their laughter combined. That thought was the only thing that kept me upright as the night dragged on. I left that reunion with my chest tight, but something in me had hardened. Driving home through the dark streets, the voices replayed over and over: Ethan's smug laughter, my father's casual condemnation, Lorraine's mocking tone. For years, those echoes had kept me small, like I was trapped in the shape they carved for me. But that night, the hurt settled into something sharper: resolve. I couldn't change how they saw me, but I could decide what I built outside their view. In the weeks that followed, I buried myself in work, not as an escape, but as fuel. My little operation, the one they brushed off as tinkering, was quietly becoming something larger. Word of mouth had already spread through the city, but I began thinking bigger. I formalized the business, filing the paperwork, getting a clean new logo, and setting up contracts that made it clear I wasn't just fixing gadgets. I was offering a specialized service: data recovery and secure system support. Schools, clinics, even law firms needed someone who could step in fast when everything went dark, and I had built a reputation for being exactly that person. The first big break came from a mid-sized medical practice. Their entire patient database was locked after a ransomware attack. Panic was written across their faces when they called me late on a Friday night. I pulled 2 of my employees in, and we worked around the clock for 3 straight days. When it was over, they offered me something that made my head spin: an ongoing security contract with a retainer larger than my entire annual income just a few years prior. That contract opened doors I hadn't even considered. Suddenly, I was in boardrooms with executives, shaking hands with people who had their fingers on real levers of power. One of them, a board member who also chaired a regional business development council, asked if I'd be willing to speak on a panel about cybersecurity and small businesses. I said yes. And that one event spiraled into more: local news segments, business journals, podcasts. I became the data recovery guy in the city, the one people called when everything was falling apart. And then came the invitation that made my stomach flip. Nora called one afternoon, sounding frazzled. "Hey, Callum," she said, "this is random, but would you mind meeting with Mark's company? They're working on a major project and having a data management nightmare." I told him you might be able to help. Mark's company wasn't just some firm. It was a nationally recognized engineering outfit with contracts worth millions. Sitting across from their project managers a week later, I realized I wasn't just troubleshooting anymore. I was architecting systems, designing the digital framework for projects that would shape skylines. The deal went through, and suddenly I was tied directly to the company that would soon be joining my family through marriage. That's when it clicked. I wasn't just successful now, I was in a position where people who had once dismissed me depended on me. Sometimes directly, sometimes through networks they didn't even know I was part of. I could play this quietly, invisibly, until the right moment came to let the truth unfold. At the same time, whispers of my success began trickling back through the grapevine. A cousin mentioned seeing me in a business article. An uncle joked that I must be rolling in it now, but quickly changed the subject. Even my father, though he never acknowledged it outright, started asking oddly specific questions during phone calls with Nora. Questions she later admitted were really about me. Does Callum really have an office? How many employees does he actually have? He never asked me directly, of course. That would have required facing the fact that he'd been wrong. Still, I kept my silence. I let them wonder. I let them fill in the blanks with their own suspicions, because I knew the setup wasn't complete yet. The final piece slid into place when I was invited to join a regional business council myself. The same one where my client's board member had first opened doors for me. Sitting around that table, I realized just how much influence I now carried. Grants, contracts, partnerships. These weren't just numbers anymore. They were opportunities one could steer, recommend, or withhold. And suddenly, the balance of power between me and the family that had branded me a failure felt very different. I didn't announce it. I didn't brag. I simply tucked it away, patient as ever, waiting for the moment when all the years of mockery and dismissal would come crashing into the reality of who I had become. And when Nora's wedding date drew closer, and I knew the whole family would gather again in one room, with Mark's colleagues, with their polished image on display, I realized the stage was setting itself. I wouldn't need to say a word. The truth would speak for me. The wedding day arrived in the kind of golden haze you only get in late summer. The venue was a stately manor on the edge of the city. All white columns and manicured lawns, the sort of place that my father would point to and say, "Now that's class." Nora looked radiant, Mark steady and proud at her side. And for once, the family seemed united under a single purpose: appearances. Smiles were polished, suits pressed, laughter a little too loud, the kind that strains at the edges. I arrived early, not because I wanted to mingle, but because I wanted to see the place without all the noise. The staff greeted me by name. Mark had insisted I come as more than just family, but as a guest of importance. That small detail already shifted the tone. Inside, the reception hall gleamed, and tucked neatly at the corner of the bar was a small placard listing the evening's sponsors. My company's logo was right there, alongside a handful of recognizable corporations. It wasn't gaudy or oversized. It was subtle, but undeniable. My family wouldn't notice it right away, but eventually they would. During the ceremony, I kept quiet, content to watch Nora glow with happiness. But at the reception, when the music softened and dinner began, the stage for revenge quietly built itself. Mark's colleagues had come in full force. Engineers, project managers, even a few executives. I recognized some of them from meetings. They recognized me, too, and they didn't hesitate to cross the room, shake my hand, and thank me for the work I'd done. "Callum, you really saved us during that system crash," one manager said warmly, clapping my shoulder. "We wouldn't have delivered on time without you." Another leaned in, voice low but reverent. "Your security framework was genius. Honestly, I've never seen anyone move that fast." I thanked them. Modest, but deliberate. Every word chosen with care. And all the while, I felt the stares. Lorraine pausing mid-laugh to listen in. Ethan stiffening, his fork halfway to his mouth. My father's jaw tightening as yet another guest approached me first, not him. Even Mom glanced nervously between the faces, as though trying to process a puzzle she'd never been taught how to solve. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. During the speeches, Mark stood with his glass raised and began thanking people. He spoke of Nora's kindness, of his parents' support, of the joy of the day. And then, casually but firmly, he added, "And I want to thank Callum. Most of you know him as Nora's brother, but what you may not realize is that he's the reason my company made it through one of our toughest challenges this year. His work didn't just save us, it allowed us to grow, to expand, to be here today with less worry on our shoulders. Callum, you've been incredible, and I'm honored to call you family." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was real, genuine. People turned toward me, nodding, clapping. For once, the attention wasn't pity or mockery. It was respect. I raised my glass, calm, steady, not gloating, just acknowledging. My father's hand trembled slightly as he set his drink down. Ethan's smile had vanished completely. Lorraine whispered something sharp to a cousin, but her eyes betrayed her. She was rattled. As dinner continued, I didn't need to push the revenge any further. The work was doing it for me. One by one, Mark's colleagues sought me out, asking for business cards, dropping hints about future projects. My company's name came up in conversations my family couldn't control, on lips they respected too much to dismiss. And each time, I caught the flicker of realization spreading across their faces. The person they had mocked, belittled, and cast aside was standing in the very center of the success they admired. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw their words back at them. I simply stayed calm, polite, measured, because the true revenge wasn't in shouting, "I told you so." It was in making them sit there helpless as the world they wanted so badly to impress turned toward me instead. By the time dessert was served, the shift was complete. No one dared mention failure. No one joked about tinkering. Even Ethan sat silent, his usual arrogance evaporated. My father avoided my gaze entirely, his silence more damning than any words he could have spoken. And as I sipped my coffee, the hum of conversations swirling around me, I realized I hadn't needed to destroy them with anger or spite. The truth itself had been enough. Still, I could feel something more building. An opportunity not just to let them stew in silence, but to deliver the final, undeniable reminder of who I had become. The night wasn't over yet. The final moment came not with shouting, not with some grand reveal, but with a quiet detail that no one at the reunion table a year ago would have ever imagined. After dessert, as people began to drift toward the dance floor, Mark's father approached me with a firm handshake. He was a tall man, commanding in presence, the kind of person my father would normally bend himself in knots to impress. "Callum," he said warmly, "Mark's told me everything you've done for his firm. Truly impressive work. You should be proud." I thanked him modestly, as always. But then he added, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "We were actually just talking last week about how invaluable your company has become to the region. The council is lucky to have you. You've built something remarkable." The words landed like a gavel strike. My father's glass froze halfway to his lips. Ethan blinked hard, the color draining from his smug expression. Lorraine's mouth opened and closed, no words managing to escape. And in that suspended silence, every insult they'd ever thrown at me, every failure, every mocking laugh hung in the air, exposed for what they were, lies they told themselves to keep me small. I didn't look at them right away. Instead, I nodded graciously to Mark's father, exchanged a few polite words, and only then turned my gaze to my family. My father's eyes finally met mine. But for the first time in my life, he had nothing to say. No lecture, no sigh of disappointment. Not even a half-hearted joke. Just silence, heavy and undeniable. Ethan fiddled with his tie, pretending to check his phone. Lorraine busied herself with her napkin, cheeks flushed red. For years, they had waited for the world to confirm their version of me. That night, the world had done the opposite. And the beauty of it was that I hadn't had to argue, hadn't had to fight, hadn't even had to raise my voice. Reality had done all the work. Later, when the music swelled and people crowded the dance floor, Nora slipped over and hugged me tightly. "I told you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. One day they'd see. I didn't answer because there was nothing left to say. I simply let the moment sink in. The sight of my family, for once, unable to look down on me. They had mocked me into the ground, but now they were the ones squirming in the silence, forced to choke down the truth with every polite smile. As the night wound down, I stood near the edge of the room, watching them scatter like shadows under a rising sun. And that's when it hit me, clear and final. They hadn't just lost the power to call me a failure. They had lost me. And for the first time, I walked away from them with my head high, knowing they would never forget the silence that followed. Honestly, I'd love to know what you would have done in my shoes. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who just refused to see you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to know.